In philosophical ethics, you're essentially a consequentialist or a non-consequentialist. Consequentialists want to maximize good outcomes. Whatever action can bring about the best outcome is the action I ought to perform. And good outcomes are, well, good. The non-consequentialists like a good outcome just as much as the rest of us, but they care about how it gets brought about. They think that we're more than just pawns in some big ethical chess game. Instead, we're persons, and there are constraints on what can be done to us in order to achieve outcomes. The ends do not always justify the means.
Hi, John.
I spoke with John Taziolus about the problems inherent in maximising the good.
I think there's a whole series of reasons to doubt that there is a general requirement on us to maximize the good. Now, one reason to doubt it is maximization seems to indicate that you could always consider various possible courses of action and then figure out the value of performing each of them and then identify the one that has the greatest value. And it could be that the nature of value is too complex to allow that sort of comparison. If value were very simple, as Bentham thought, if value was simply a matter of pleasure and pain, then it might be that you can make that kind of calculation. But if value is complex, if the elements of well-being are very diverse and complicated, include things like knowledge and friendship and accomplishment, these are quite distinct things and they're quite different. And then the idea that we can somehow look at all the options before us and see, well, which of them produces the most of all these different values, that calculation might simply be an incoherent task that we're setting ourselves.
Defining well-being isn't the only complication. Christian Barry explains.
We, of course, should be open to criticizing our moral practices and beliefs, but the idea that we would sort of simply adopt a theory because it happens to be simple and hold on to it come what may doesn't seem to be very plausible. Bernard Williams said that there's a fundamental difference between the way in which it's sort of appropriate to view science and the way we should view ethics. So in science, he said we should be trying to abstract away from our particular perspective and sort of view the world from a sort of a God's eye perspective. He didn't use that theological thing, but we have what he calls an absolute conception of the world as it is, entirely separate from us. And he thought that some moral views like consequentialism were guilty of trying to import this picture, which is appropriate for how we should be looking at the world in scientific terms, to how we should view our relation to it as ethical agents. We shouldn't view the world from this sort of abstract, detached point of view. We have, as ethical agents, always to view the world from our own particular position with our own particular lives and aims and ambitions and interests. And we can't simply abstract entirely away from it. We can to some extent, but we do great sort of injustice to moral experience and the moral life if we exaggerate the degree to which we can do that.
OK, so if we abstract our point of view too much, then we're going to lose sight of individuals. If I get sacrificed in the game in order to bring about victory, I rightly care about that, and I feel I should have more say in the matter. I've got my own life to lead, my own needs and concerns, and I want to stay in play on the board. That might be at odds with the goal of maximising the good in terms of the bigger picture of the game.
One motivation for non-consequentialism is to say that, in a sense, consequentialism makes everything and everybody fair game. This is problematic, that we shouldn't think about people this way. We shouldn't think about all people as causal opportunities to bring about good. We should rather think about individuals as having their own protected space and their own sort of claims to go on living their life without interference from others. So this idea that each individual has a kind of protected domain of choice and space is one that has been used as a way of resisting the idea that people can simply be used as causal opportunities. If we don't allow people to have this sort of protected space, there's a sense in which nothing really belongs to anyone. Your body doesn't really belong to you if you don't have some sort of special claim to protect this resource. So many of our practices seem to assume this idea that we have sort of a protected space that can't just be interfered with by others.
What we ought to do, according to this kind of theory, depends not just on the outcomes, but on respecting individuals' rights. It may be that it's wrong to interfere with someone's actions, even if we think we can make them better off by so doing. I asked John Taziolas if he agrees.
Absolutely, and it could even be that the thing you're trying to do is actually in the best interests of the individual who you're treating in a certain way. But nonetheless, they may have a right to make a decision for themselves as opposed to being subject to your decision. So it might be that, if your parents decide for you who your partner should be, maybe they would be better at identifying a suitable partner than you would be. But most people would believe, even if that were true, you nonetheless have a right to decide for yourself who your partner is because of the importance of people making an independent decision in this kind of domain. And even if the result is they have a worse life in consequence.
If respecting rights is supposed to guide our ethical action, then we need to be clear about what rights are. There is a general tendency to apply rights all over the place. I have a right to choose a partner, a right to so many days off per year, and so on. But sometimes we need to consider the needs of individuals in the context of the wider community. Some of my needs might not be fundamental enough to generate a human right.
Once you start talking about rights, and once rights start being acknowledged as an important form of moral language and an influential form, then, of course, people start wanting to package everything as a matter of rights. And so we see this in human rights thinking that if you want to launch a campaign for something, then there's a tremendous temptation to launch that campaign for increased health spending or whatever under the rubric of this is a human rights requirement, because that seems like a pretty hefty demand. Now, of course, if human rights requirements are going to be important and distinctive, not everything can be a human rights requirement. And then that raises the question, well, there are many things that further my interest in health, but does everything that furthers my interest in health constitute something that I have a right to? Where do I draw the line between, for example, I'm suffering from some kind of condition that would require billions of dollars in order to find a cure to it? Surely it would help me, it would further my interests if society devoted billions of dollars to curing the disease that only I suffer from. It doesn't follow, though, automatically from that I have a right that society devote those billions of dollars to find a cure from the disease that only I am suffering from. So the question then is, to what extent do my interests generate rights? And to what extent is there something that would further my interests, but I don't have a right to that?
So if you think human rights are important, then you want to think hard about which rights exist and when it might be more plausible to just talk about a person's interests. Now, rights are not the only important non-consequentialist idea. Some non-consequentialists believe that what really matters is a person's intentions. If I bring about some outcome through acting intentionally, then that has a different moral significance and might be harder to justify than bringing about the same outcome unintentionally.
So, for example, many people make the distinction between a case where we kill civilians as part of a sort of a terror campaign in order to get the opposition to sort of stop its fight against us, and a case in which we kill civilians not by intending to kill them, but because we're sort of bombing a munitions factory and we recognize that collaterally these people will be killed. Now, some people have the intuition that there's a difference between the sort of tactical bombing, which results in some civilian death, and terror bombing, which directly intends civilian deaths as a means to bring about this sort of same end.
Now, it might sound intuitive to draw a general moral distinction between doing some bad thing and merely allowing some bad thing to take place. But how comfortable are we really with discounting the moral significance of things like collateral damage? Shouldn't we care about all the people we actually kill, even if that's unintended? The consequentialists, like Peter Singer, believe that unintended consequences are just as important as intended ones.
One place where I think it's really important to criticize the idea that it's always wrong to kill, but it's not wrong to allow people to die, is in terms of people living in extreme poverty in some parts of the world and other people like us living affluent lives where we think nothing of spending money on luxuries that we really don't need, where we can easily transfer our resources, or a small part of our resources, to people in much greater need. In earlier centuries, that wasn't the case, so we didn't get this kind of morality. But I think for each of us living in affluent countries with money to spend on things that we don't really need. We need to think about the importance of saving lives, not only the importance of not taking lives. To live ethically, it's important to actually do the positive things to help others, not simply to keep the negative moral rules that says you shouldn't harm others.
In the real world, we are not pawns in a game. Unlike the pieces here, we are persons, and we interact in ways that are much more complex and less set than in chess. One view is that consequentialism just oversimplifies what is a really complicated moral world. And this might ultimately explain why we ought not to try and maximise the good. Non-consequentialists worry that it's just impossible to know all the possible outcomes of all the possible actions I might perform in ways necessary to try and maximise the good. And they also worry that by surveying the moral terrain from a distance, we're going to overlook the significance of individuals and how we ought to treat them. Non-consequentialists still want to win. They still care about outcomes, but they also care about how we treat the pieces along the way. What do you think? Next time, what sort of moral values should our government follow?